Hello and welcome. I'm Ramaya, Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and I'd like to welcome you to AC Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders. We are honored today to host the Honorable Gregory Meeks, United States Representative for New York 5th District and Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. During his time in Congress, Chairman Meeks has proven to be a champion of multilateralism with decades of experience in foreign policy, a true leader and a believer in building fair relationships and international coalitions with other countries for a more stable and prosperous future. Even amid pressure to focus solely on US-China competition in the African theater and among figures who have long underestimated the power of the African continent, Chairman Meeks has been an advocate of the strategic importance of US-African relationships and the unique strengths of the United States-African diaspora. Chairman Meeks is an important, powerful, and refreshing voice in US engagement with the African continent with extensive knowledge of the region. Chairman Meeks joins us today to discuss his committee priorities and to dig deeper into his ambitions for renewed engagement with the African continent and the path toward a new African narrative focused on the opportunities presented by the world's youngest continent. His leadership, in tandem with the leadership of figures such as Linda Thomas Greenfield, Akuna Cook, and Dana Banks in the Biden administration, presents a historic opportunity to shift America's relationship with Africa at a critical and pivotal moment in history on both sides of the Atlantic. Of course, this conversation about Africa cannot occur in a vacuum. The most recent COVID-19 resurgence and the Taliban's return to power, among the latest events that have shaken the international community, will have an impact on Africa and the Foreign Affairs Committee's agenda towards the continent. So, Chairman Meeks, I'm looking forward to this conversation. For our audience members who are following along, please use the hashtag AC Front Page on Twitter to ask questions and engage in today's conversation. Chairman Meeks, we have many topics to discuss today, but before we fly to Africa, I do not forget that you are the representative of the 5th District of New York, where you are currently located. We show you these days on TV with President Biden alongside the victims of Hurricane Ida. Please, could you tell us what is the situation on the ground?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you all for having me. I appreciate the Atlantic Council and all the work that you do on a continuous basis. It was devastating. I lost 2 individuals who reside in my congressional districts from the flood waters that came in to their home and basically drowned them in a basement apartment. We see homes that and individuals who are generally immigrants and the poorest of the poor devastated by the flooding that have taken place from a record rainfall. Many have said that this was 1 in 500 year occurrence. But I think that what it shows is that climate change is real and is here, because what once was considered 1 in 500 years or 1 in 100, within the last 2 weeks, we have Hurricane Henri that caused some damage and flooding. And then 2 weeks later, we said that was record rainfall. And then 2 weeks later, we have Hurricane Ida, the remnants thereof, come and do even greater damage. So we are still working, trying to help people get to shelter. I'm looking out my window here in New York now and see additional rain falling, and I will be there later today because my heart is going out to those individuals, many of whom are still sleeping on wet mattresses, some of whose homes and foundations have been cracked. So there's plenty of work for us to do, and I'm going to be, once I finish this interview, out there with my constituents, working with federal authorities as well as city and states, trying to help people get their lives back together and to safety.
Yeah, thank you. New York was the epicenter of pandemic, and now the hurricane, and soon the 20 years of 9/11. After the summer, the diplomatic agenda is hectic, and the news plays weird tricks on us. My first question: how do you see this collision between the 20 years of 9/11 and the formation of the victorious Taliban government of the Americans after 20 years of a war that began on 9/11? So there is a serious questioning in the U.S. leadership in the world, or do you see things differently?
Well, I think I see them somewhat differently. When I think about it, I've been in Congress now for 22 years, so I was there 20 years ago when we had to vote on whether or not to go and engage in war in Afghanistan. The purpose of us going to Afghanistan was to make sure that we uprooted al-Qaeda and make sure that the homeland, the United States of America, was safe from future attacks by al-Qaeda. We accomplished that. We did that. There's not been another attack on the homeland in 20 years. Then the question came forward with what we call the authorization for utilization of armed forces. What do you do then? So we thought, because we saw a horrific situation, that maybe there was an attempt to nation build. And then we had and ended up in the longest war in American history, 20 years. And what I think that it shows and that everything does not have a military option, and the military does not resolve all issues. 20 years, we showed that the military did not. The quick deterioration of the Afghan security forces shows that military response is not going to answer everything. Diplomacy has to play a role in it. And I think President Biden has decided that it was time for us to pull out, once we saw that the armed forces of Afghanistan was not going to fight, for us to pull out, but continue to be there and to try to work in a diplomatic way, so that we can maintain the security and safety at home, but also try to make sure those that are remaining there, to see if the Taliban will keep its words and some of the commitments that it's made, particularly as it pertains to women and girls. We will see. So it's a situation where I think that America has decided that, and I think it's the right decision, that we can't go in and occupy countries and stay forever. We need to do what we can do to support and make sure that our interests are taken care of, and work globally to fight counterterrorism. It's one reason why, for example, a number of the committees, when I became chair of the committee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I made sure that we put global counterterrorism in one of our committee settings, because terrorism now is global, and we've got to work in a multilateral way to combat and fight that. So information sharing and working together to combat these terrorist organizations is what's important. And I think that also resonates to what we have to do on the continent of Africa, for example, because what we don't want, and we know that groups like al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia, and other terrorist groups in sub-Saharan Africa have held the view that they could wait out the United States. Well, you can't wait out the United States. We're going to work multilaterally with our folks to strike and kill those that we know that are looking to attack in the United States of America and or some governments in those.
Yeah, Chairman Meeks, we'll come back to Africa later, but let's stay a few minutes on Afghanistan, and let's give the floor to my colleague, William Wexler. William is the director of our Middle East Center in the Atlantic Council, and prior to the Council, Wexler's most recent government position was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. So he advised multiple secretaries and helped coordinate interagency policies. Since you mentioned counterterrorism, he knows everything about counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. So, William, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for appearing with the Atlantic Council on this. I know that you share my relief from the news that we got today that there may be 200 more Americans coming out of Afghanistan, even after our withdrawal, through I'm sure no shortage of diplomacy on our end. I wanted to note, Mr. Chairman, that yesterday we had Liz Sherwood-Randall, the White House counterterrorism advisor and Homeland Security advisor, with us, and she said, quote, that we have already established over-the-horizon options and are adding to them in order to monitor and, when necessary, disrupt threats that may emanate from Afghanistan, unquote. And then I know also back on August 25th, you said that your committee would be conducting very strong oversight to ensure, as you rightfully and as President Biden rightfully pointed out, that our core continuing interest in Afghanistan, which is the counterterrorism interest, that we maintain the capabilities that we need. I guess my question for you is, how do you assess so far the administration's ability to build that over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability so that we both know about threats that emerge and have the ability to do something about it in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you for that question. And let me say this. Number one, we have been doing that in other countries. In fact, on the continent of Africa and other places, because terrorism is global, without being an occupying force. It's about working in a multilateral way with our allies and others that are on the ground and getting information that's necessary. And I think that we're well on the way working and cooperating with the regional allies. And we will see if, in fact, the dialogue and the conversation that we're having with the Taliban. For we know that ISIS, for example, who committed that horrendous attack at the airport, are also enemies of the Taliban. They were as much going after the Taliban as they were the United States. So there's a mutual interest in sharing information to make sure that we destroy that terrorist organization. And I would hope that that would continue in Afghanistan. I think that those are the mechanisms that are being put in place that I know are being talked about with the Taliban, because we are talking with them. We're not recognizing them, but we're talking with them, which is necessary. But our regional allies also. It is designed to make us safe, but don't make the United States occupiers. And I think that the American people do not want us to be occupiers. And I think that what we've learned also is that just having a military there doesn't change things. Now, on the committee side, we're going to start just that oversight that I talked about earlier. On Monday, we'll have our first hearing. It'll be the first time that Secretary Blinken testifies in an open hearing before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And then we have other plans to oversee and look at the 20 years that we've been in Afghanistan. So we know that it is not all about how it ended, but even how it began, and all of the activities that took in the middle. And the community will be looking at all of those things and looking to bring people in to testify at the various phases of our involvement in Afghanistan so that we can review and make sure that we have continuing knowing what we need to do to continue to keep us safe as we have been for the last 20 years.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. The Afghan tragedy has a singular echo in Africa. So in the Sahel, where some fear that France's withdrawal could lead to the same scenario. Others, on the contrary, think that France should leave to avoid getting bogged down. The jihadists located in the Sahel reacted very quickly, as they were galvanized by the Taliban's victory. The leaders of of this movement pledged alliance to the Taliban at the time of their foundation. They paid tribute to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and said, we appreciate this victory after 2 decades of patience. So I'm curious about your feeling. Despite the kilometers, can a terrorist arch exist between the Taliban and other terrorist groups in the world, and particularly on the African continent? And from the Congress or the House perspective, could we imagine you launch a hearing series on this issue related to what is happening in Afghanistan and the US war against international terrorism?
No, I think that what you will see is we will still be very focused on working and destroying terrorist organizations on a global basis. And since it is global and a threat to everybody, we will be doing that in multilateral ways. We will be doing that when what is one reason why it's good to have the alliances and stable government, but we'll be doing that with our NATO allies. We'll be doing that with the governments that we can work with on the continent of Africa. We'll be doing that with our allies, even in Central and South America, working collectively together, because we've got to do this, because terrorists and terrorism can pop up any place in the world. And as I've indicated, that though I do have the concerns about the instability throughout the Sahel, for example, and that's creeping into West Africa and the long-standing terrorist threats in East Africa and emerging threats in Central and South Africa, Southern Africa. So it raises that question about the role the United States and others should play in the long-term stabilization efforts in Africa particularly. But what I think that what we must demonstrate is that through our engagement with these allies, we can fight and defeat terrorism. And that's what our goal is. And that's what we'll continue to do without being occupiers. The role in Afghanistan, and what I think that you saw us pulling out, is saying that we're not going to be occupiers or nation build, but we are going to be fighting against those groups in a multilateral way. And we must do that also collectively in fighting the propaganda that some of them put forward, but also by, which we'll probably talk about later, making sure that we are investing in stabilizing governments and reducing poverty and having social corporate responsibilities throughout the continent particularly, so that it then incentivizes individuals to think that the only way that they can continue to move is to join terrorist groups.
Yeah, we appreciate what you are saying about this American role on the world in fighting global terrorism, etc. But when it is about democratic values on the African continent, how do you analyze the coup, the last coup in Guinea, after the coup in Mali, in Chad? Africa seems to be returning to the military coup. Are they really, people are asking, are they really bad news here? Because I understand that the main opposition leader, Diallo, has voiced his support to the coup against Alpha Condé, and the new masters of Conakry have freed dozens of political prisoners. So can a coup be a salutary? How will you handle this in the framework of the Summit of Democracies this administration is announcing for the next month?
Yeah, look, there have to be consequences, and the international community must work in unison to exact those consequences. The people of Guinea expect and deserve much more. But we also have to look at the context, because context does indeed matters. And this is where we've got to talk about making sure that democracy flows, because we had an attempt here also by the president seeking a third term, which was against, from my information, the Constitution. It was unpopular and ill-advised. So we've got to talk about democracy in all of its forms, because I think that the will of the people must be respected also to preserve democracy. And I say that with the American experience, because after January 6th, we experienced some of the same things, where we had a president that attempted to steal an election and stay. And there was a resurrection here in the United States, but it was the will of the people to say that, no, we're not going to let that person disrupt our democracy. Our democracy was at stake. And that's the kind of international and collective work that we have to do and talk about when we're talking about preserving democracy around the world. Because when you do that, then individual militaries and others that we're seeing rise up will see that they cannot defeat the will of the people. And that's what democracy is supposed to be all about, is following the will of the people of that country.
Yeah, we can say that this American policy to Africa can appear a bit contradictory, because when you raise the principles and sometimes you compare with this silence about this coup, people may feel a bit surprised. But we will maybe another day come back to that point. We need to change the narrative about Africa. That's what we already say. We always say, and I hear you when you talk about the necessity to have another look on the African continent. But maybe we should change the rules too. And when it comes to Africa, the game does not seem very fair. And here too, when we talk about this, you will see that on the economic markets, the problem is really critical. And we're going to talk about this with the CEO and president of the Africa Finance Corporation. This institution catalyzes private sector-led infrastructure investment across Africa. It is the second highest investment grade-rated multilateral financial institution on the continent. Almost 9 billion invested in 35 countries across Africa, a unique access to global capital markets to transform lives. So we are hosting today Samaila Zubeiru to engage the dialogue with you. And it will be promising because he has a lot to say about the rules and how the game may seem not fair when it is about Africa. Samaila Zubeiru, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity presented by Atlantic Council. And thank you, Chairman Meeks, for creating time to have this dialogue with us. So very quickly, the African Finance Corporation was established by a treaty of African states to provide solutions to Africa's infrastructure deficit and challenging operating environment, mainly because the infrastructure deficit reduces productivity on the continent by up to 40% and reduces economic growth by up to 2%. So clearly, there's an urgent need. So our focus is really to take ownership of the opportunities and challenges that face us as a people and try to provide solutions. And we do this by reducing the risks or de-risking the opportunities that are around infrastructure and industrialization, focusing on our ecosystem approach, whereby we're looking at how do we look at all the resources that we have on the continent. We have significant resources across the continent, but we don't do a lot of value addition in the continent. We're still exporting raw materials at the very basic level, which is why we have constant boom and bust economies. Anytime there's a rally in commodity prices, we do well. Anytime there's volatility, we don't do as well, mainly because we don't add value. And I'll give you some examples just so that you can put it in context. So 75% of cocoa in the world comes from West Africa. 90% of platinum in the world comes from Africa. Over 60% of the copper and cobalt in the world comes from Africa. But we export all of these as raw commodities. So we don't create the jobs that are associated with this, and there's no impact in the communities. We have 1.2 billion people on the continent. Over 60% of them are under 30 years old. And all of these people need jobs. The way we trade, is very important, especially with the energy transition in the world now. We just export raw materials through several voyages. The emissions on ocean voyages is higher than the emissions of Germany. We go to places like Asia with the commodities, China in particular, and then these commodities are processed, using coal-fired plants in some cases, and then sent back to Africa for consumption. These commodities could be processed on the continent using, renewable energy sources, create jobs on the continent. So we've done several pilots that have been successful, whereby we have increased earnings of African economies, grown exports by up to 4 times, increased earnings by up to 5 times by moving from just raw materials to veneer, plywood, and indeed furniture, and of course, reducing imports into those economies. So we have demonstrated this. In fact, our very existence demonstrates that Africa is a business opportunity. It's not a basket case. It's not a candidate for aid. You can do business here and be profitable. We have been paying dividends for the last 9 years. We made a profit every year since our inception. We have an investment grade rating, so we have access to financial markets. However, our access is constrained by prejudice, I would say. So, for example, general views that Africa is a risky place, but it's not. The project finance default rates in Africa are lower than that in the US. And this is a study done by Moody's and Fitch, certainly lower than that in Latin America. But an A3 institution like ourselves in Latin America would access funding from international capital markets at up to 150 to 200 basis points cheaper than we would, simply because we're in Africa. Even though the project finance default rates in Latin America is much higher, and it's also much higher in Asia. So these are the fundamental issues around the narrative that we would like to engage with you to see how we can provide solutions. Because we have all these opportunities, but we can't do anything with them without capital. We have significant capacity that requires capital to unlock, and capital is restricted. Now you have a lot of agencies like USDFC, which recently gave us 200 million, which we appreciate that, but we get a lot more money from Europe. We get a lot more money from Asia than we get from the US. So it's how can we work together in a way that we can unlock more funding from America, taking leadership in how to change this narrative for Africa, especially because America has declared an energy transition. They've declared that they are going to transition to the green economy. Just for you to note, an electric car has a lot more minerals and metals, 6 times more actually than a normal car. A wind turbine has 11 times more minerals and metals than a gas turbine. So a lot of mining is going to take place, and all of these resources are in Africa. We need to do things differently. We need to stop exporting raw materials. We need to find ways of developing the mines in a sustainable way, and processing the output in a way that we can create jobs on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I got to tell you that the AFC is going to play a tremendous role, and it is something that I'm excited about. And when I became chair, is one of the reasons why I said that the United States Congress, I know on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, will not have Africa on the back burner, but we've got to put it on the front burner. And that's not only good for Africa, that's good for America. Because when you look at where we're going to be in the future, where all the growth is, where the difference is going to be the continent of Africa. So if we want to make sure that the future, and I start looking at this now once I have 2 granddaughters, is good for people around the world, we better look at how we are investing and working in a collaborative way with the continent of Africa. It's a fact that the Africa continent is the fastest growing, and I think 1 out of every 3 people in the future will be coming from the continent. So we've got to change the way that we look at the continent. And we've got to make sure that the agency of the people on the continent, like AFC, has a role to say, not for us to come into Africa and say, this is what you need to do, this is what you got to do, et cetera, but also to make sure that we're hearing from you and others on the continent to say, well, yes, we want investment in climate technology. We want investment in infrastructure. We want investment in financial services. And we have that dialogue and conversation. And I'm trying to encourage and will continue to encourage American companies because of that connection, because many African countries are not integrating further into the capital markets, that the scope of the investment in trade in Africa is expanding, including natural resources, but of course, expanding past that. So what do I look to do when I look at what I do in my own community, in my own district here? America, for example, is a global leader in venture capital and private equity. That helps give access to funds that one would need to create better infrastructure, better technology, better schools, better energy on the continent generally. So I want to make sure that we get engaged at that level and make sure that as a result of that, that global scale of investment and making sure that there's not a disadvantage to the continent because of increased rates and things that are disproportionate is erased and eliminated. And another way of doing that, I think, is we've got to build, and what I'm looking to do and work with the Biden administration to do, is to build a coherent all government strategy that can help lead some of that investment from the private industries also. A strategy that we can do to harmonize, because I find even harmonize our objectives and harmonize our efforts in trade and investment, as opposed to USAID being different than the Department of Commerce, being different from someone else, within the US agencies world. Harmonize, come together, working with those on the continent itself through items like Prosper Africa initiative, so that there is a focus on the development aspect of it and not just the aid aspect of it.
So, Chairman, if I may just quickly butt in, we have ideas that we've been working on, and we've come up with structures that we think can help. We would like to see how we can engage with you. Just one thing for you to live with is insurance and securitization. These are two mechanisms that we could use to mobilize capital to the continent and increase the scope of activities of American financial markets to do more than just to find channels to deploy the huge amounts of capital that they have. So we would like to have a discussion with you as quickly as we can. Probably Atlantic Council can facilitate a meeting, and for us to share ideas and to work with you on our research on the best way to intervene, going by our experience doing this for the last 15 years.
That is much welcomed by me. It is something that we definitely need to do. And it's also an opportunity for us to take advantage of those in the African diaspora here in the United States and make those bridges also. So I look forward to doing that. And I hope my staff that's listening also on the line that we make that happen shortly. I know that on our committee also that the chair of the subcommittee, Karen Bass, is focused in that way also. So we can have a holistic conversation and dialogue, getting your thoughts and ideas, utilizing the strategies that you have so that we can build bridges and get the investments, because you can't do anything without having the dollars, the access to capital to do what's necessary to grow economies. And it has an enormous wealth. When you grow economies in that regards, in the way that you're describing right now, some of the issues that we talked about earlier, coups, they lessen the opportunity to have coups. Having democracy, it helps to create a strong democracy. Creating jobs, we heard, I heard our President Joe Biden say recently, when you talk about investing in climate change and investing in technologies, he thinks of a four-letter word. It's called jobs. Yes. And that helps stabilize the situation. So I very much look forward to hearing your ideas and thoughts and trying to implement them and getting them part of the Prosper Africa initiative, because we should not have that initiative without inclusion of thoughts of individuals and organizations like AFC.
Thank you, Chairman.
The time is running. Samaila is one of the voices that deserves to be heard in Africa, and I agree. I appreciate you accepted his invitation. Now, I'd like you to speak with Dr. Franny Leoutier, because the time is running. She will talk about after the impact of COVID-19, about all this business strategy, because the impact is important on the African continent. So I'm Dr. Franny Leoutier, who is taking the floor now, was previously Chief of Staff of the President and Vice President of the World Bank and Senior Vice President at the African Development Bank. And she's now, she's killing everything on the African continent now as CEO of Southbridge Investment and partner at Southbridge Group. Franny, Dr. Franny Leoutier, would you like to say a few words to Chairman Meeks?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yad, and Chairman Meeks. Thank you for your attention and interest in Africa. My question to you is going to narrow down to the energy sector, because Sumaila has covered the broader aspects. And when you look at the period before the pandemic, 90% of the world's population had access to electricity. But since COVID-19, the situation has become very, very challenging, mostly for Africa, because the 10% that didn't have access to Africa, the majority of them are people, didn't have access to electricity, the majority of them are people in Africa. And the pandemic has made it very challenging to meet the United Nations goal of electricity for all by 2030, particularly for Africa, because it has made electricity less affordable and made the inequalities in access to electricity even more severe. Now, Africa had made tremendous progress with a lot of innovation in renewable energy before the pandemic. And so my question to you is that when you look at the aid per capita for the energy transition, Africa gets the lowest compared to other regions of the world. So what do you see as the role of the United States and the international community in supporting Africa to recover from this pandemic-driven energy deficit, and to also help the continent get back on the path that it was on before COVID, especially given the very importance of the energy sector, as Sumaila had just highlighted, for Africa's development and for the world? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let me first say, we've got to make sure that Africa has access to the vaccine. And I know the United States has sent 25 million vaccines over, but when you have over 1 billion people, 25 million just not enough. So the United States and the entire world needs to get together to make sure that everyone has access to the vaccine. Because until we make sure that the COVID pandemic is over, it's not over if you just go to the United States and say that everyone has been vaccinated there. So if anybody's unvaccinated, all of us are unsafe. So the whole world has to focus on making sure that everybody has access to the vaccine. That's number one. Number two, I think that, and here's what part of my job is, and I think it's tremendously important. When you talk about getting access to electricity and making sure that you have energy, the first thing has to be is you have a voice. What I've got to make sure is that your voice is heard in these international meetings. What I have found when I go and hear, that there's an international conversation around climate change, for example, and they're trying to put reductions in carbon emissions, but they're not talking or hearing from the African people and the African continent as to what they need to do, that sometimes these emissions might be too high. And so therefore it would deprive Africa of gaining the resources that's necessary and making sure that it's staying up to date with reference to energy. That's got to stop. Your voices have to be at the table. All of these international forums and meetings that we're having, Africa has to be there also. That's the number one thing. And then in talking about it, we've got to put the resources collectively, multilaterally, into accomplishing the goals so that Africa can have the energy that it needs. We just talk about how fast it's growing. It can't grow and prosper and help and be a part of the rest of the world without the rest of the world also engaging. There's only one planet when we talk about climate change. So we've all got to work collectively together. And we can't tell the continent to do one thing when it doesn't have the resources, nor is it listened to by the other countries of the world. So what I'm telling Secretary Blinken, what I'm telling the President of the United States is to make sure Africa's voice is heard and take it into consideration. Don't just talk to it, work with them. That's how we make a difference. So too often we've taken it as an afterthought. Or as we say here, we look at some of the negative things that may have taken place. That's no way to look and to build for a future. I truly believe
I think we have to
is on the continent.
We are very, very tight about the time, so I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We could have talked about so many other topics, youth, creative industries, roles of diaspora, but you will come back to speak to us about all these innovative topics. I would like to
I want to say one
thank
other
you.
thing
Yeah.
that's important for us to invest in.
Yeah.
That's women